For over a century, Kaiser Wilhelm II has been viewed as either a madman or a warmonger who brought his country to destruction by provoking the First World War. Following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies planned to have him tried as a war criminal, and only the refusal of the Dutch Queen and her government to extradite him prevented the planned tribunal from ever taking place. Since then, though, he has largely been portrayed as guilty of the charges that were levelled against him, as the century-old propaganda continues to be believed. I am the granddaughter of an English prisoner of war, and as a tiny child I listened often to my grandmother singing sad war songs and telling me of her brother who was killed fighting for the English near Ypres in 1916. As I grew older, I spent years trying to make sense of a conflict in which so many millions had died. But all I was taught left me even more confused, particularly as I began to delve deeper into the life and true character of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The more I discovered, the more I realized that virtually everything I had been told about that war, and particularly about the Kaiser, was false, and that far from being a warmonger or a madman, he had done his utmost to preserve peace. Until 1914 he was described as the Apostle of Peace, or the Peace Kaiser, who had spent his 26-year reign attempting to improve the lives of his people and to maintain good relations with his neighbours. Even on the eve of the war, he was desperately seeking some means to resolve the international crisis which had suddenly been blown out of all proportion following the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the last of the European leaders to mobilize his army, and as one American commentator observed, he was the most sorrowful man in the world when he realized that war could not be avoided. From the moment that hostilities began, the British Bureau of Propaganda set out to destroy his reputation, severely distorting his image and portraying him as the instigator of the war. So successful was this campaign that even today he is widely viewed as a cruel son, a megalomaniac and a tyrant. But I believe that, contrary to all we were told, the truth is really quite simple, and I sincerely, with all my heart, believe Kaiser Wilhelm II deserves a far better reputation than that with which he has been so cruelly saddled for over a century. In my book, The Innocence of Kaiser Wilhelm II, I hope I have succeeded in portraying him in a far fairer light. Thank you for listening.
Hello. Today I'm going to be talking with Christina Croft about her new book, The Innocence of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Hello, Christina.
Good morning.
This book casts Wilhelm in an entirely new light. What inspired you to write it?
Well, I think we all grew up with the image of the Kaiser that came from the First World War propaganda posters, of his huge moustache and grotesque features, a sort of caricature of a monster or a madman. But over many years, as I've studied Queen Victoria's letters and researched the role of the monarchs in the First World War, it became increasingly clear that this is a very, very distorted image of who he really was, and that he was a far deeper and more interesting man than we had been led to believe. So I hoped that by writing this book I might be able to present a different aspect to him, one that is far more appealing and I hope far more accurate.
Why do you think he has received such a bad press for the past 100 years?
Well, I think there are probably three reasons for this. The first being that the First World War propaganda posters were so effective that they still remain in the consciousness today. And the second one is more personal in that he had a very, very difficult relationship with his mother, and she often wrote to her mother, Queen Victoria, about him, and her letters survived, whereas we have very few of his own letters about the same events that she's describing. And therefore we get a very one-sided view of him, and I think it's quite an inaccurate view in many ways, because so much of it is really expressing his mother Vicky's personal opinion and exasperation at times. The third reason I think is probably the most significant, and that is that it pays to present a monarch who was overthrown, and his entire dynasty was overthrown, and he was forced into exile, as a tyrant or a madman. If he were portrayed as a man who was genuinely doing his best for his country, it would be very hard for the powers that be to explain why he had to be removed from his position of power. And that, of course, was one of the stipulations that the 14 points, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, insisted upon for the creation of an armistice, that he and his dynasty had to go, and the country would no longer be an autocracy. So obviously it paid to paint him in a very, very poor light, and again that image persists to this day.
What sort of man do you think Wilhelm was?
In many ways I think he was a conflicted man, and one who was greatly misunderstood. From his earliest childhood he had very serious self-doubt, partly because he could never live up to his mother's expectations of him. His mother, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter Vicky, was intellectually brilliant, and all of her children disappointed her in that they couldn't live up to her own academic standards. That didn't mean that she didn't love them, but it made William feel something of a disappointment to her. It didn't help that his paternal grandparents, the King and Queen of Prussia, did everything to keep his mother away from him because they feared her English influence. So the less time she spent with him, the more he developed this idea that she didn't like him. And to make matters worse, he was born with a disability of his arm. It never grew properly. And when he was only a child, he heard people say a one-armed man could never be king. And that made him determined to prove that he was stronger and more powerful and more capable than anybody else. So he developed this attitude of bluster and bluff and talking too loudly, laughing too loudly, being really over the top in everything that he did. And it was all a mask to conceal his deep-rooted shyness. And those who got to know him really well and saw beneath the mask realized that underneath it he was a very kind and gentle-hearted man. Even his own eldest son, with whom he didn't always see eye to eye, later wrote that he was full of tenderness and always thinking of other people. And I think that is true. He did make a lot of mistakes. He had many faults. He was outspoken and would often say things without thinking of the consequences. But his intentions were never malicious, and he really did mean well, and just wanted to be loved.
And what sort of Kaiser or emperor was he?
One who really wanted to do the very best for his people. He tried very hard to understand his people and to understand their needs. And although he was raised with the idea that the German emperor was an autocrat, or at least the Prussian king was an autocrat because he had the dual throne, he hoped that the autocracy would be one that would benefit his people. He sought to maintain peace with other countries too, because he knew his people had suffered from war, and now they were prospering thanks to years of peace. And so throughout the first 25 years of his reign, while virtually every other country in Europe was involved in one war or another, Germany was at peace. He sought to understand the workers, and during his reign too, Germany developed one of the best benefit programs in the whole of Europe. There were unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, all kinds of innovations to help ordinary people to improve their education and so on, and all of this had the Kaiser's backing. He was also keen to bring culture to the ordinary people, opening libraries and museums, and all these aspects of his character are often forgotten or overshadowed by the fact that he ultimately ended up in such a terrible war.
The book demonstrates that rather than wanting war, he was desperate to avoid it. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, as I mentioned, Germany was prospering throughout his reign. It was becoming one of the major exporters and importers in the world. New foreign markets were opening up everywhere, and it was widely agreed that German products and German industry were the best in the world. And for this reason, as the Kaiser said, a merchant doesn't make war on his customers. And again, he often said, only in peace can trade prosper. So it would have been madness, suicidal madness, for him to deliberately take his country into a war. And on a more personal level, he saw the benefits to humanity of maintaining peace. He certainly absolutely did not want war with England. Several British politicians commented in 1913 and 1914 that he, more than any other person, had done everything possible to maintain good relations with England. And even a French pacifist commented that there was no greater man of peace than the Kaiser. To the very last moment, he was writing letters to the Tsar and to King George in England, urging them to work with him to maintain peace. And when war did break out, an American commentator noted, there was no more sorrowful man in the world than the Kaiser when he realized that war could not be avoided.
As an English person, during your research, what shocked you most about what you discovered?
Oh goodness, there are so many shocking aspects to this story. And as you say, as I'm an English person who was raised believing that the war came about because Germany invaded Belgium and the Kaiser was aggressive and wanted to take over the world, the truth was terribly disconcerting. It was very shocking to realize, for example, that as early as 1907, many British writers and politicians were calling for a war with Germany and searching for an excuse to make war with Germany, quite simply because, as several prominent writers said, we were envious of German prosperity and the fact that their goods were better than ours. Once the war did break out, it was shocking to realize how the Kaiser was defamed. So many stories were told about him that simply were not true. It was never mentioned, for example, that his own generals sidelined him on many occasions, not because he was a madman or because he was incompetent, but as one first-hand witness said, they were afraid of the Kaiser's kind heart. It was equally shocking to realize that German submarine warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare, which brought America ultimately into the war, was virtually forced upon them by the underhand actions of Winston Churchill. When the war broke out, a blockade was placed around Austria-Hungary and Germany in an attempt to starve the civilians into submission. The Kaiser's fleet was kept in the harbour and only the submarine fleet could get out. But initially, whenever they attacked a British vessel, and they only attacked naval vessels, they gave plenty of warning and allowed the crew to escape, often taking them themselves to safe havens. And then Churchill ordered the British vessels to fly neutral flags, so the German submarines would let them pass, but as they came close enough to the submarines, they would then raise the Royal Navy ensign and attack the submarines. And this happened so often that the submarine commanders were no longer able to protect their own men and so automatically fired on any ship after giving due warning, and for this they were condemned. For several months they stopped doing that, but again they kept being attacked and had no alternative but to defend themselves. Over and above all of these things, though, was the realization of how much money, how many millions of pounds were being made by various industrialists and arms dealers and moneylenders who were prolonging the war deliberately, quite simply because it was so profitable to them. There are many more shocking aspects of this story, but obviously there isn't time to go into them all here.
I was particularly fascinated by his opinion of Hitler. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I think it's very unfortunate that in many people's minds the Kaiser is almost equated with Hitler or like a precursor of Hitler. But in fact, from his own writings, it was obvious how the Kaiser saw Hitler as the complete antithesis of himself. He actually gave an interview about him in 1938, in which he said, "There is a man alone, a man without family, without children, without God. He builds legions, but he doesn't build a nation. A nation is created by families, a religion, tradition. It's made up out of the hearts of mothers, the wisdom of fathers, and the joy and exuberance of children." And then he went on to say that Germany under Hitler was an all-swallowing state disdainful of human dignities and the ancient structure of our race. He spoke of German poets and musicians and all that Hitler seemed to be destroying, and he ended by saying, but of our Germany, which was a nation of poets and musicians and artists and soldiers, he has made a nation of hysterics and hermits, engulfed in a mob and led by 1,000 liars or fanatics. So he was obviously very much against Hitler, and any suggestion that he was in any way supportive of the Nazis is obviously a complete untruth.
All in all, his story is rather tragic, isn't it?
It is. It's terribly tragic, because here is a man who I do believe meant well and really could have been an excellent Kaiser, but for 100 years he has been seen in such a terrible light, and I can only hope that my book goes some way to creating a more accurate image of him, and one that I think he genuinely deserves. Thank you very much.
I've just finished reading Christina Croft's stunning Shattered Crowns trilogy. The trilogy digs for and unearths what was really behind World War I, and presents answers not part of commonly held beliefs and standard propaganda passed down over decades. Her characters are alive on the pages, and her readers come away with new understanding of all involved. I am delighted to have the opportunity to ask Christina several questions that I think will be of interest to her readers. This is quite an immense subject. What inspired you to write the trilogy?
It is an immense subject, and one which I found quite daunting when I began the trilogy, but I felt I had to write the book because many years ago my grandmother used to look after me when I was a small child, and she spoke often of her brother who died during the First World War. He was killed in action. And as I grew older, it always intrigued me as to know what this war was about, and I learned in school all the usual well-known causes of the First World War, and yet they didn't really make sense to me. It seemed such a pointless war that achieved very little. So I began to look more deeply into it, and as I did so, I found so many discrepancies in the usual account of the war that I simply had to put them down and express it in this trilogy.
While researching it, were you surprised by anything you discovered?
I would say shocked and appalled rather than surprised. Obviously, I knew of the horrors of battles and so on, but I wasn't aware of so much going on behind the scenes, the number of opportunities, even during the July crisis just before the war broke out, to prevent this from happening, opportunities that were simply ignored. And again, throughout the war, the number of opportunities for peace, which again were ignored. It also shocked me how many people gained from this war, people who made a fortune out of it, while ordinary soldiers from every nation involved were going off thinking they were fighting for a very good cause. I was equally shocked about the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, because the more I looked into that, it seemed very clear that the usual account of what happened was not quite the whole truth after all. There is just so much more to it. I felt from the start that I was touching the top of a very, very murky iceberg, and this could go on indefinitely, the research into it.
Were there any parts which were particularly difficult to write?
I found the entire trilogy difficult to write because I was constantly aware that I was writing about real people, millions of real people whose lives were ruined by this dreadful war. And to pick out specific parts, I think the murder of the Romanovs obviously is such a horrific thing to write about. And I also found it quite difficult to write about the build-up to the war when all the time I was thinking, oh, if only somebody had listened to this, if somebody had listened to that, all of this could have been avoided. Though also I think it was difficult to get inside the mind of Kaiser Wilhelm, because he was an erratic man, but I think he has been greatly maligned, and trying to really understand where he was coming from and portray that was quite difficult.
The Kaiser usually has quite a hard time from historians, yet you seem to sympathize with him. Why is that?
Propaganda posters created by Britain and her allies during the war must have been very effective, because even today people still believe them and have an image of the Kaiser as a madman or a megalomaniac monster trying to gobble up the whole of Europe. In fact, that image is very far from the truth. The Kaiser was prone to making irrational statements and having strange outbursts which have been quoted to kind of prove that he was this kind of monster. But in fact, when you look beneath that, he often said things that he didn't really mean. His cousin, Princess Alice of Athlone, who knew him very well, spoke of how much he loved England, and it was obvious that he loved his English grandmother, and I believe his greatest desire was to create closer ties with England. At the same time, within his own country, he did an awful lot of good that's now forgotten. He was very keen to promote culture and the arts. He had, at the beginning of his reign, he had refused to turn against the workers of his own people. He's seen as sacking Bismarck because he wanted power for himself, but in fact, Bismarck was urging him to crush the workers, and he refused to do that. There were many, many good aspects to his character, and I think if he had been listened to, rather than marginalized and turned into some kind of caricature of himself, he would have come down very differently in history.
Obviously, you were writing about real people, but was there one of them who stood out for you more than the other in creating this work?
Well, all of the emperors and Queen Marie of Romania were doing their utmost for their people throughout the war. All of them were, and that's often overlooked. But perhaps standing out most for me is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who, had he been allowed to live to become emperor, would have completely transformed Austria-Hungary and consequently all the Central Powers, I believe. He was a very forward-thinking man who had, just a couple of weeks before his death, met with Kaiser Wilhelm with a view to creating closer ties with Russia and finding ways to maintain peace in Europe. That's very often omitted from the history books. Equally, Archduke, later Emperor Karl of Austria, who inherited the war basically. He was kept out of the way at the beginning of the war and went off to fight, so he had first-hand experience of the battles, and from the moment he became emperor was doing everything possible to try and create peace, and yet all his efforts backfired on him, and he was eventually ousted by his people and viewed as a traitor by his allies, which I think is absolutely tragic. He was a man who just wanted to bring an end to all this unnecessary slaughter, a very good man.
Without giving anything away, the trilogy ends on a rather sad note, doesn't it?
Well, unfortunately, since it's not a story and it's true, I think it had to end on a sad note, because the war achieved exactly what it set out to achieve, and that was, in my opinion, the overthrow of the Russian, German and Austro-Hungarian monarchies, so that the resources of those countries could be taken over by international businessmen, and the banks could also be taken over by international bankers. I firmly believe that was the purpose of the war, and it was successful. The casualties, apart from the millions who died on the battlefields, were the emperors, who to this day have been blamed for a war that was not of their making.
Is there anything that you hope your readers might learn from reading these books?
I think it would be arrogant of any author to claim to be able to teach their readers anything, but like all books, I hope that my trilogy provokes thought and maybe makes people question not only the history that we've been taught, but also how things are today, because I believe the same things are still happening. People at that time were manipulated. They were manipulated through fear that they were about to be attacked by this terrible, terrible enemy from overseas, and also manipulated by being made to stand in horror at what was happening. Take the story, for example, of the supposed crucifixion of, I can't remember if it was a French or a British soldier, but this was widely told in Britain and pictures were shown to make people be very angry at the Germans and very willing to fight a war against these butchers. In fact, that incident never happened. In the same way, people were terrified. They were told that unless they joined this war, something awful was going to happen to them, that the Germans would move in and take over all of Europe, and that made people be quite willing to sacrifice their own freedom to go along with the war and to support it. And surely these same methods are used today. People are still frightened into responding and being willing to lose their freedom, sacrifice it to governments, and people are equally willing to go and support a war overseas if we are told that something dreadful is happening. But we really need to look deeply to make sure that what we are being told is the truth, because history does repeat itself, and if we learn anything at all from it, it surely is that we don't make the same mistakes that we made in the past.